welcome back. Let's relax together and enjoy a terrifying tale of terror. Tonight, our subject ventures into the woods and ends up meeting something much worse than the big bad bear.
I've spent a lot of my life outdoors. I wasn't one of those guys who always stayed inside, glued to a screen. No, I'd be the one calling my friends, dragging them out to go hiking, camping, anything that got us into nature. So, when we finished our first year of college, we wanted to celebrate with something big, something none of us would forget. My friend Tim suggested we go up to northern Canada, way off the beaten path, and check out some old indigenous sites he'd heard about. Tim was a history major, and he had been reading about these places that were hidden deep in the wilderness, places where ancient indigenous tribes used to live. He claimed they had sacred spots that no one really visited anymore, almost forgotten by time. Being the adventurers we were, we jumped at the idea. It was the end of May, and summer was just starting to creep in. The air was still crisp, and the nights dropped to that bone-chilling cold you only get out in the wild. It was perfect. There were 5 of us, me, Tim, Nick, Brian, and Chris. We had been best friends since high school, so we trusted each other. And we figured this would be just like any other trip, just a little more remote, a little more intense. That's what we thought. We took a long drive north, away from civilization, past the last gas stations and tiny towns. Eventually, we hit the dirt roads, bouncing along in Tim's old Jeep until the trees became thicker and the sky seemed further away. It took hours before we finally reached the spot where we planned to park and hike in. From there, it was all on foot. We packed light, just enough food and gear for about 4 days. The trail wasn't well marked, more of a suggestion than an actual path. But we were used to it. It was rugged, but we were prepared. Tim had maps and a compass, and we'd done enough of these trips to know the drill. By the time we reached our first campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that twisted and swayed with the wind. There was something about this place that felt off. I brushed it off, though. Everyone gets spooked in the woods at night, right? That first night, we set up camp by a small lake. The water was still, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a loon. We built a fire, made some food, and Tim started going on about the history of the area. He told us about the old tribes, how they lived off the land, and how some of their stories had been passed down for generations. He was always the storyteller of the group, but there was something different in his voice that night. He mentioned the Wendigo, an ancient being in indigenous folklore. It wasn't something I had heard much about, but apparently it was a spirit of insatiable hunger, something that would possess a person and turn them into a monster, a cannibal. We laughed it off, just campfire talk, but I remember Brian shivering even though the fire was blazing. "Wendigo or not," he said, "it's too cold for comfort." I didn't think much of it. We were deep in the woods, and the cold was expected. But as the night went on, strange things started happening. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something walking around our campsite. I thought it was just one of the guys taking a leak, but when I poked my head out of the tent, I saw everyone was still in their tents, sleeping. Whatever was moving out there was bigger than any raccoon or deer. I could hear it breathing, this heavy, labored breathing, like it had been running for miles. I sat there, frozen, just listening. The footsteps circled our camp, slow, deliberate, like it was watching us. After what felt like hours, the sound just stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I told the guys, but no one took me seriously. "Probably just a moose or something," Nick said, stuffing his face with breakfast. I wanted to believe him, but something about that breathing didn't sit right with me. We packed up and kept moving further into the forest. The deeper we got, the more the trees seemed to close in around us. The light didn't reach us as much, and the air grew heavy, like it was harder to breathe. Tim was leading the way, talking about the sights we were looking for, but even he seemed a little quieter than usual. It wasn't until late afternoon that we stumbled upon the first sign. It was an old stone marker, worn down by time and weather, covered in moss. Tim got excited, saying it was a boundary marker for the sacred land we were entering. But the rest of us didn't feel that same thrill. The forest was silent, not just quiet, silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was like we had stepped into a different world. And then we found the bones. At first, it just looked like an old deer carcass. Maybe a wolf had gotten to it. But the closer we looked, the more we realized something was wrong. The bones were clean, picked completely bare, and scattered like something, or someone, had deliberately spread them out in a pattern. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I wasn't the only one. Chris muttered something under his breath and refused to go any closer. Tim, on the other hand, was fascinated. "It's probably some kind of ritual," he said, snapping pictures. "Maybe a warning." A warning. That stuck with me. We camped again that night, though none of us really wanted to. There was a tension in the air that wasn't there before, like we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling, and I knew the others felt it too. That night, the footsteps came back. This time they were louder, closer. I wasn't the only one who heard them. Nick shot up in his sleeping bag, eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, Brian bolted out of his tent, flashlight in hand. "It's just some animal, relax," he said, trying to sound brave. But we all knew it wasn't just an animal. Brian shined his flashlight into the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it couldn't penetrate very far. The trees were thick, and whatever was out there knew how to stay just beyond the light. We all stood there, waiting, listening to the footsteps circling us. They weren't rushing or frantic. They were slow, deliberate, almost taunting. Every now and then, we'd hear a twig snap or the crunch of leaves, but we couldn't see a damn thing. It was like it knew how to stay just out of sight, but close enough to keep us on edge. Then, just like the night before, the sounds stopped. Total silence. No movement, no breathing, just that unnerving stillness. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. We didn't sleep after that. We just sat around the fire, keeping it stoked, our eyes scanning the tree line, waiting for something, anything, to show itself. But nothing came. By the time the sun rose, we were exhausted. Tim was the first to break the silence. "Look," he said, his voice low. "Maybe we should turn back." I was shocked. Tim was always the one pushing us forward, wanting to go further, to explore more. If he was spooked, then something was definitely wrong. But none of us argued. It wasn't worth it anymore. Whatever we were looking for out here wasn't worth this feeling of dread that had settled over us. We packed up quickly, eager to get back on the trail, back to the safety of the car. The hike back was brutal. Every step felt heavier, like the forest itself was trying to hold us back. Tim was quieter than usual, his head down, not saying much. The rest of us were on edge, jumping at every little sound. About halfway through the day, we hit a section of dense forest where the trail disappeared entirely. We hadn't noticed this on the way in, but it seemed like the forest had changed, like it had closed in behind us. Tim was fumbling with the map, trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong, but nothing made sense. Then we heard it again. The footsteps. They were distant at first, coming from deep in the woods, but they were getting closer, fast. I felt that same chill from the night before crawl up my spine, and I wasn't the only one. Brian's face was pale, and even Nick, who was usually the calmest of the group, was starting to look scared. "We need to move," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." We started walking faster, practically jogging through the trees, but the footsteps followed us. Every time we thought we'd put some distance between us and whatever was out there, the footsteps would start again, closer this time. By late afternoon, we were all on edge, barely holding it together. And then Tim stopped dead in his tracks. He turned to us, eyes wide, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I thought he meant the footsteps, but no. It was something else. A voice. Faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. It was calling Tim's name. I froze. There was no one else out here. No one should know our names. But the voice kept calling, soft and rhythmic, like it was trying to lure him into the trees. Tim's eyes were wide, his face drained of color. I need to go, he muttered, stepping towards the trees. No, I said, grabbing his arm. Tim, stay with us. He shook his head, dazed, like he couldn't even hear me. I have to go, he whispered, his eyes glazed over, his body pulling towards the voice. We had to physically drag him away from the tree line, forcing him to keep moving. He fought us at first, but eventually, he snapped out of whatever trance he was in. His face was white as a sheet, and he wouldn't talk for the rest of the hike. It was getting dark again, and we knew we couldn't keep going like this. We needed to set up camp, but none of us wanted to stop. Every minute felt like we were being hunted. Against our better judgment, we made camp in a small clearing. No one wanted to admit it, but we were too exhausted to keep moving. The fire crackled, the only sound in the eerie silence of the forest. That night, everything fell apart. I woke up to the sound of Brian screaming, not just yelling, screaming like he was being torn apart. I shot up, heart pounding, and saw him thrashing in his sleeping bag, his face twisted in terror. Nick and Chris were already trying to hold him down, but he was convulsing, his limbs flailing wildly. His eyes were wide open, staring at something none of us could see, and his mouth was moving. But the words that came out didn't sound like his. It was like something else was speaking through him. Something ancient, something hungry. I grabbed his shoulders, trying to snap him out of it, but he just kept muttering in that strange voice. And then, all at once, he stopped. His body went limp, and for a moment, we thought he was dead. But then he sat up slowly and stared at us with eyes that weren't his own. It's here, he whispered, his voice low and guttural. It's been watching us, and it's hungry. We all froze, fear clawing at our throats. Brian's face was twisted in a sick, knowing smile. It's been waiting for us. For me. He stood up slowly, his movements jerky, like he was trying to control his body, but something else was fighting him. Nick stepped back, his face pale. Brian, what the hell are you talking about? But Brian didn't answer. His eyes flicked towards the trees, and then he smiled, a cold, predatory grin. The Wendigo, he whispered. It's here, and it's inside me. Before any of us could react, Brian lunged at Tim with unnatural strength, knocking him to the ground. His hands were around Tim's throat, squeezing hard. Nick and Chris tackled him, pulling him off, but Brian fought like a man possessed. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack, heart pounding. I didn't want to hurt my friend, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. Brian twisted free from Nick's grip and turned toward me, that twisted smile still plastered on his face. It's hungry, he whispered, and so am I. That's when I saw it, his eyes. They weren't Brian's eyes anymore. They were black, soulless, filled with a hunger that wasn't human. I didn't have a choice. I swung the hatchet. Not at him, at the ground, just in front of his feet. Brian froze for a moment, the blade missing him by inches, his wild black eyes darting up to meet mine. For a split second I thought I saw fear in them, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by that same eerie, predatory smile. I won't stop, he whispered, his voice low, almost teasing. None of us will. None of us? The words echoed in my head. What did that mean? Nick and Chris scrambled to pull Tim to his feet, still gasping for air, his hands clutching his throat. The look on his face was pure terror, his body trembling as he stared at Brian. No, whatever Brian had become. We need to go, Chris stammered, barely able to hold it together. Now. But where could we go? We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any kind of civilization, with only the trees and the night surrounding us. And somewhere out there, the Wendigo, or whatever it was watching, waiting. I glanced at the fire. It was flickering, dying down to embers, and I felt a sudden urgency to keep it going. Fire. Maybe fire would keep whatever was out there at bay, or at least give us some kind of edge. "I'll get more wood," I said, my voice shaky, my eyes never leaving Brian. Nick and Chris didn't argue. They were too busy keeping an eye on him, making sure he didn't lunge at us again. Tim, still pale and shaken, nodded weakly. "Be quick," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I backed away slowly, grabbing the flashlight as I edged toward the tree line. I didn't want to go into the woods alone, but I had no choice. We needed the fire. We needed light. The moment I stepped past the first line of trees, the cold hit me. Not just the regular night cold. This was something different. It bit through my clothes, right down to the bone, and the silence out here was deafening. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps. It felt like the forest had swallowed me whole. I hurried, grabbing whatever dry branches I could find, my heart racing the entire time. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I kept expecting to see something watching me from the darkness, something lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. And then I heard it again, that breathing. Heavy, slow, labored. I froze, my heart thudding so hard I thought it might burst. The breathing was close, too close. I turned, the flashlight trembling in my hand, shining it wildly through the trees. Nothing, just the endless darkness. But the breathing continued, growing louder like whatever was making the sound was right next to me, invisible, unseen. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, clutching the bundle of wood to my chest. I needed to get back to the camp, now. The fire, keep the fire burning. But before I could take another step, I saw it. Just a glimpse, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. Something tall, impossibly thin and fast. It moved through the trees like a shadow, disappearing before I could fully make it out. I bolted. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I sprinted back to the camp, branches snapping underfoot, my lungs burning as I forced myself to run faster. The footsteps, the ones we'd heard the nights before, they were right behind me, closing in. When I finally burst into the clearing, Nick, Chris, and Tim all jumped up, startled. I dropped the wood by the fire pit, gasping for breath. "We need to keep it going," I panted. "There's something out there, I saw it." Nick didn't hesitate. He grabbed the branches and fed them into the fire, stoking the flames until they roared back to life. The light from the fire flickered across the clearing, casting long, dancing shadows over us. Brian, or what used to be Brian, was sitting just at the edge of the firelight, watching us with that same unsettling grin. His eyes never left me, and I could feel them burning into the back of my head as I crouched by the fire. "We can't stay here," Chris muttered. "We have to move." "We're not going anywhere in the dark," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "We stick to the fire. In the morning we'll figure it out." Tim, still clutching his throat, nodded weakly. "I don't think we'll make it through the night if we try to move now." Brian chuckled softly, his voice low and raspy. "You won't make it through the night anyway." Nick glared at him, but it was no use. Brian wasn't Brian anymore. He was something else, something ancient, and whatever it was hungry. Hours passed. We took turns keeping watch, but none of us could really sleep. Brian just sat there smiling, staring at us, like he was waiting for the right moment to strike. Every so often, he would whisper something, but none of it made any sense. Just garbled words about hunger and the Wendigo and how it had chosen him. The fire crackled, and the cold pressed in around us. The trees seemed to creep closer, and the shadows danced like they were alive. Then, somewhere in the distance, we heard it again. That voice, faint but unmistakable, calling our names. First Tim's, then Nick's, then mine. It was the same voice we'd heard before, the one that had almost lured Tim into the trees. But now, it was louder, closer. And then Brian started laughing, a horrible, rasping laugh that sent chills down my spine. "It's coming for you," he whispered, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "It's coming for all of you." Suddenly the fire seemed smaller, weaker, like it couldn't keep whatever was out there at bay much longer. My grip tightened on the hatchet, and I glanced at the others. Nick had picked up a heavy branch, and Chris held his knife, though his hands were shaking. Tim just sat there, staring into the flames, like he had already given up. The footsteps started again, moving around the perimeter of the camp, closer and closer. The fire was our only protection, but I could feel it. The thing out there wasn't afraid of the flames. Not really. It was toying with us, waiting for the moment we were weakest. And then Brian stood up. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on mine. "It's hungry," he said again, that horrible smile spreading across his face. "And so am I." Before I could react, he lunged at me, faster than any human should be able to move. I swung the hatchet. This time, I didn't miss. The hatchet connected with a sickening thud, sinking into Brian's shoulder, right where it met his neck. His smile faltered, replaced with a twisted look of surprise. He stumbled back, a gurgling sound escaping his throat as blood spurted from the wound. But what scared me most wasn't the blood or the look of pain on his face. It was the fact that he was still standing, still moving toward me. Brian, or whatever he had become, didn't stop. He reached up and grabbed the hatchet handle, trying to pull it out, his fingers slick with blood. I stepped back, my heart racing, hands shaking as I realized this thing wasn't going down easily. His eyes had changed again. They weren't black anymore. They were something worse, something inhuman. They gleamed with an unnatural light, like the darkness inside him was fighting to break out. Nick yelled something, but I didn't hear it. Everything slowed down, like time had warped. Brian lunged again, his arms outstretched, ready to tear me apart. Instinct took over. I dodged to the side, my foot slipping in the dirt as I reached for the burning branch Nick had been holding. Without thinking, I swung it at Brian's face, the flames licking at his skin. The fire didn't burn like normal fire should. It hissed, crackling unnaturally as it touched him, and Brian recoiled, screaming, a sound so guttural and primal that it sent chills through my entire body. He fell to the ground, writhing, clawing at his face where the flames had touched him, but he didn't scream in pain. No, it was more like rage, like the Wendigo inside him had been challenged. Nick and Chris ran to my side, both of them white with terror. Nick had the hunting knife in his hand, but even he seemed to hesitate. We had hurt Brian, hurt whatever had taken him, but he was still moving, still alive, or something close to it. "We need to end this," Nick whispered, barely audible over Brian's inhuman shrieks. "But how?" Chris shouted, his voice on the edge of hysteria. "We don't even know what the hell is happening." "We can't let him live," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "He's not Brian anymore." Tim, still sitting by the fire, was shaking uncontrollably, his face pale as a ghost. "The Wendigo," he mumbled, barely coherent. "It can't die. You can't kill it." I turned to him, frustrated. "Then what do we do?" Tim's eyes were wild, darting back and forth between us and Brian's thrashing body. "You have to burn it," he whispered. "Completely. It's the only way to destroy it. Burn it." The thought of setting Brian's body on fire made my stomach turn, but deep down, I knew Tim was right. There was no coming back from this. Whatever was left of our friend was gone, consumed by the thing that had taken him. The Wendigo. Brian stopped thrashing and slowly rose to his feet, swaying, his body hunched over like an animal. His skin was blistered and charred where the fire had touched him, but his eyes, they were still glowing, still full of that awful, insatiable hunger. I swallowed hard, gripping the burning branch tighter. We have to do it. Nick nodded, though he looked like he might be sick. Chris stared at Brian, his face pale and full of disbelief, but he didn't argue. We all moved quickly, no time for second-guessing. Nick tossed more wood into the fire, feeding the flames until they roared higher. Chris grabbed the hatchet that was still embedded in Brian's shoulder, yanking it free with a wet, sickening sound. Brian barely flinched. The three of us surrounded him, moving cautiously, ready for him to strike again. But Brian, or the Wendigo, just stood there, swaying, his eyes darting between us. He wasn't smiling anymore, but I could see the hunger in his expression, the desperation. He knew what we were about to do. "Do it," I whispered to Nick. Nick hesitated, his hands shaking as he held the burning branch over Brian's head. I could see the conflict in his eyes. We had known Brian since high school. We had been friends for years. But this thing standing in front of us wasn't our friend anymore. Brian's lips twitched, like he was about to speak, but before he could say anything, Nick shoved the burning branch into his chest, hard. The fire caught almost instantly. Brian screamed again, this time in real, agonizing pain as the flames spread across his body, licking at his skin, turning his clothes to ash. He staggered back, collapsing onto the ground, his body writhing as the fire consumed him. The smell was unbearable, burning flesh and hair. I gagged, turning away as the flames grew brighter, hotter. Nick and Chris stood there, staring in horror at what we had done, but I couldn't watch. I didn't want to remember Brian like this. For a moment, I thought it was over, that the Wendigo had been defeated, that we had finally ended it. But then Brian's screams stopped, and I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, like the sound of an animal in its death throes. I turned back to the fire, heart pounding, and saw something move within the flames. It was Brian's body, or what was left of it, but it wasn't thrashing anymore. It was standing. Slowly, it rose from the burning pyre, charred and twisted, its skin blackened and cracked, but still very much alive. I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me as I realized what was happening. The fire hadn't killed it. It hadn't even slowed it down. "Get back!" I yelled, stumbling away from the flames as the thing that had once been Brian turned its glowing eyes toward me. It stepped out of the fire, its body smoldering, ash and embers falling from its skin like snow. Its mouth opened in a grin, wider than any human mouth should be able to stretch, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "You can't kill it," Tim whispered, his voice hollow. "It'll never die." Nick and Chris backed away, their faces white with fear. I could see it in their eyes. They were ready to run. But where could we go? There was no escaping this, no escaping him. The Wendigo took another step toward us, its body crackling with heat, its eyes locked on mine. I could feel its hunger, its need. It wasn't just coming for us, it was going to consume us one by one, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking as I grabbed Nick and Chris, pulling them away from the clearing. "Run, now!" We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We just ran, deeper into the forest, the Wendigo's growls echoing behind us. But I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before it found us again, and when it did, there would be no escape. The Wendigo had chosen us, and it would never stop hunting.